kids, PS3 Dad here. There was this prevailing sentiment during the PS3 era in the late 2000s, early 2010s, when people were saying that the PS3 was the dark ages for JRPGs. I'm here to talk about this today because looking back on the system now is a lot different than what we had back then. I think now, some might say I have rose-tinted glasses, but I think the benefit of looking back on something over time can really give us a unique perspective that maybe we didn't have when we were there. I mean, I love JRPGs. Why would I kill stuff when I could kill stuff?
Behold, my most powerful strike! Radiant Blade Dance!
They complained that they weren't getting the quality or quantity that we had in generations past. Those old enough to remember the boom in the genre during the SNES and PS1 eras that carried through the PS2 generation were noticing that they weren't getting as many games and they just weren't as good. I want to take a close look at some of the JRPGs on the PS3 and decide once and for all if it was really the worst generation for JRPGs or whether people just didn't know what they had at the time. Right off the bat, you can see that I'm a huge weeb. But at first glance, there aren't as many games in the genre on the PS3. I don't own every single one, but this is a pretty good representation of the best the platform has to offer. The real question is, are they any good? For context, you need to remember what the gaming industry was like back then. This, and this. There was a huge explosion of both open-world games and first-person shooters during this era, and they were taking the world by storm. Games like Oblivion, Skyrim, and the Fallout series showed gamers what an RPG could be, and many thought of traditional, linear, and turn-based RPGs as yesterday's news. When a game like Final Fantasy XIII was released, it was heavily criticized for being too linear. A hallway simulator, they called it, but today, people are becoming fatigued with open-world games, thanks to publishers like Ubisoft pumping out huge games like Assassin's Creed and Far Cry, which begin to feel like a chore with checklists of boring tasks to complete and dozens of hours of unnecessary bloat. Going back to some of the more linear experiences now on the older consoles can feel like a breath of fresh air, a chance to focus on the story and combat and not get bogged down with too much fluff. Sometimes we don't know what we had at the time, and it can only be appreciated years later with the benefit of hindsight. So are these games worth your time? And there's some real bangers here, and maybe a couple stinkers. Ew! Obviously, this is nothing compared to the number of JRPGs on a system like the Nintendo Switch, but if you've been around long enough to remember systems like the N64 and the GameCube that had no more than a handful of JRPGs the entire generation, you'd look at this pile and say, hey, that's pretty respectable. I certainly wouldn't call this the Dark Ages or anything. Let's take a critical look at some of these games one by one and decide for all time whether the PS3 was really the worst era for JRPGs. Final Fantasy XIII. Okay, this is gonna ruffle some feathers. This game was very controversial when it launched. Most people were upset because it was not the Final Fantasy that they wanted. Gotta remember what I said earlier about the explosion of open world games, and then Final Fantasy XIII comes along as a very linear game with a very restricted path to follow. Today there's a resurgence of people praising this game, but at the time it got more hate than any other Final Fantasy game to date. It's gotta be said, though, that to this day, this is one of the most visually stunning, beautiful games on the entire platform. Almost nothing even comes close. Sure, you're restricted for more than half the game to small hallways and pathways that you have to follow, but that only allows them to give you a much more curated experience. Everything feels very guided. It's like an interactive movie. There's so much going on with these gorgeous cutscenes. The combat is fantastic. It's really the last true turn-based Final Fantasy, and despite all the controversy, it was popular enough to get not one, but 2 sequels, which is pretty much unheard of in this franchise. The combat was very kinetic and fast-paced, and the game continued to move along thanks to one key mechanic. At the end of the battle, your party would heal up automatically, allowing you to press forward without needing to focus so much on finding healing items or save points to heal. Items were still useful in battle, but you wouldn't have to rely so much on exploration and grinding smaller enemies for money to buy potions. Is 13 the best game in the franchise? Most would say no, not even close, but more and more people are admitting that this is not a bad game and merely misunderstood. Ni no Kuni. Another game that is just absolutely timeless. This is one of the best JRPGs ever made, and one of the best looking games not just on the PS3, but maybe one of the most visually appealing games ever made on any console, thanks to the hand-drawn visuals done by Studio Ghibli. Ni no Kuni has such a charming story. A young boy who sets off to another world to bring his mother back from the dead, meets all kinds of wild and fantastical creatures, and befriends familiars that help him on its journey. The music is so powerful and emotional when it needs to be, but light and happy at all the right times. The whole familiar mechanic of connecting and catching these monsters and training them up might remind some people of Pokemon, but it's completely different because it's an action turn-based hybrid. I can say pretty confidently that this game has a permanent spot in my top 10 video games of all time. There is an HD remaster available on newer systems, but this game looks and plays so good on the PS3 that you really aren't missing much playing the original version. Trails of Cold Steel. The first console entry in a long-running series. First time we got to see these characters in HD. A huge interconnected world between multiple arcs telling the politics and the life stories of a huge cast of characters. For those of you who don't have access to a PSP or a PS Vita to play the first 3 games in the Sky trilogy, this might be an excellent place to start, although you'll probably want to find a way to go back and play the other games at some point. It is worth noting that the first game, Trails in the Sky, is being remade and re-released in 2025, so getting a start on the first 2 Cold Steel games and then jumping back to that might not be a bad rhythm. But what can I say about this game? I've never felt so attached to a cast of characters before in any game ever. The amount of character development that they do across the runtime of this game and the world building, the sense of actually living in the game and being a part of the world is something that I don't think I can really give you the impression of without you actually playing. It's absolutely remarkable how much you come to care about these characters and care about the events in this world, experience the tensions between a noble faction and the royal family, the commoners, and resistance fighters all trying to shape the land in their own image. This game, guys, I'm almost done the first game. I have the second game waiting for me. It's absolutely fantastic, and I can't speak highly enough about this game. This is definitely like a top 10 out of 10. Couldn't get any better game. Alright, now we have Kingdom Hearts 1.5 and 2.5. This is 2 physical discs that represent like 6 or 8 games. It might be cheating a little bit to use a remake in this context because these are PS2 and games from other consoles, but the package that you get with these 2 games is hard to ignore. Not only is this arguably the best way to experience Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, but includes a bunch of the other games from other systems like the DS that people may not have had access to. And if you know anything about Kingdom Hearts, you know that the story just keeps getting crazier and crazier. And if you miss out on a couple of games, you could be entirely lost. Having the entire series up to that point available on these 2 discs is an absolute treasure. Nier. People look at the sequel, Nier Automata, and the remake, kind of not a remake, Nier Replicant, as absolute masterpieces. But people often forget that this is part of a larger franchise that started with the Drakengard games on PS2. Nier is an absolutely fantastic game on the PS3 with so much to recommend it. The story is batshit crazy, the combat is really cool, the world that you have to explore is expansive and interesting, and the characters are lovable and unique. The way the game starts off in modern future and then goes back to medieval times is a twist that keeps you guessing all the way through the game. Do you think I'd play just any dog shit? Odin Sphere. Another game that is technically a remaster of a PS2 game, but is so much better for being on stronger hardware. Odin Sphere is different than most RPGs because it is set up like a side-scrolling beat-em-up, but it's definitely an RPG. The developer Vanillaware is known for having beautiful art styles and fantastic original takes on the genre. This game is no exception. You'll fall in love with the 5 main characters and their quest to stop Armageddon in the land of Arion. Each character has unique abilities and styles of combat, and you must master each to become the ultimate Valkyrie. Alright, let's take a look at the Atelier series. Not just one game, but the 6 or 7 that are on the PS3. This series was painfully obscure for most of its lifespan, really only reaching widespread popularity in this current generation with the Atelier Ryza trilogy on Switch and PS4. So you might be surprised to learn that there was like 6 or 7 of these things on the PS3. The Atelier series is divided into arcs of 2 to 4 games. The PS3 hosts 2 major arcs: the Arlen trilogy, consisting of Atelier Rorona, Atelier Maruru, and Atelier Totori, and the Dusk trilogy made up of Atelier Aisha, Shali, and Eska and Logi. While these games are certainly niche, at least at the time, they are all very fun and very charming role-playing games focused on alchemy, basically crafting, where you spend time out in the world battling monsters and collecting items to take back to your atelier and craft into useful items and stronger weapons. Some people are intimidated by the time limits in the earlier games, a clock system that is constantly counting down, but there is always ample time to do what you need to do. While you could play any one of these games, it is always best to start at the beginning of an arc, as stories and characters do grow and evolve throughout the interwoven narrative. Another series I want to take a look at, and not just a specific game, is the Tales of series. The Tales series has been running a very long time, but most of the early games were Japanese exclusives. After the success of a couple of the titles on the PS2, the PS3 saw a huge push to bring the series into the mainstream in the West. We got Tales of Vesperia in 2008, Tales of Grace's F in 2009, and then Tales of Xillia 1 and 2 in 2011 and 2012. Even though the PS4 had launched several years earlier, the PS3 was still getting support from Bandai Namco as late as 2016, with Tales of Zestiria releasing in 2015 and Berseria the next year. Tales of games have always been action RPGs. You directly control your character in a hack-and-slash combat with combos and special moves to spice things up. The gameplay varies from game to game, as does the base difficulty, and the stories are largely unique, not connected to each other except for the direct sequels like Xillia 2, so you can pretty much start anywhere. It can be said that there is a Tales game for everyone, so while you might not like one, there are probably 2 others that you will love. These games always set a fairly high bar for quality, being just below Final Fantasy in many people's opinion, one of the best long-running series out there. Alright guys, well that's my list for today. I wonder what you think, and let me know down in the comments below. Do you think the PS3 was actually a failure for JRPGs? Do you think this was a dark age for JRPGs? Or have some of the games that I mentioned here today convinced you to take another look at the library on the PS3? I can definitely say that the PS3 was not the best console for JRPGs. Looking at something like the Nintendo Switch that has just like hundreds of them, and you know, other systems like the PS4 was absolutely fantastic. The PS2 and the PS1 were absolutely fantastic, but there are definitely systems that were worse. The N64 had like, what, 2, maybe 3 JRPGs, and one of them was Quest 64? Like, come on. The GameCube had, what, 5? Fire Emblem, Skies of Arcadia, Tales of Symphonia. That's pretty much, there was a couple others I can't think of right now. But really, guys, like, the PS3 is not the Dark Ages for JRPGs. It is not the best console in the world, but it is certainly far from the worst. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Stay classy.